Hello, everyone. My name is Zeon Stewart. This is my first blog as a student in the Flatiron Academy, attending for the software engineering program. Today, I'm presenting my first blog, which is written on event listeners. I chose to do something simple for my first blog. That way I can just get the practice in of actually writing about something that I feel like I'm somewhat more comfortable with before I start to dwell into other things. So with today, I'm going to be going over event listeners and specifically in relation to JavaScript, because that was what we were learning at the time. So vanilla JavaScript. I started off by talking about why, or asking the question of why event listeners are important and what do you need to understand. And then emphasizing that you can break it down into a less technical vernacular in order to make it easier to digest exactly what's going on as you're looking through codes that have event listeners. So at the top, I was going for similar to like a resource style format that you would normally see, to where they have it and they use words that represent other things and not necessarily a variable in itself. So that was the approach that I wanted to take here, and then kind of make my explanation a little bit more understandable for the average non-programmer. So I took I just wrote out an example on my own here, where we have an event listener that's attached to an element, and the event is a click, and then it has a function that will invoke when that click happens, and will send an alert that will say hello world. So by taking this base example, or very simple example, I broke it down into each word. That way the user, or the person reading this blog, can then go through and follow along word for word. All right, this means this means that, this means this. So that's what I was going through, went through with elements, broke it even down to add. I separated it even further from add event listener. I just chose to break that down even further just to make it more streamlined. Uh let's see. So yeah, following that's what this whole paragraph in my blog is about, is just me going through each one of these words and individually breaking it down. So I use that as the first example. And then here I have the picture of the end result when that something gets clicked. After that, kind of recap what happens, and then go through okay, remember this logic. We're going to hold on to it, knowing that all event listeners aren't that simple as the example that I gave. And then I used events, or made events the focus for it, even though this is about event listeners, because I think that's the most complicated part about event listeners, is just the understanding of the actual what the event is in itself. So after starting off with that click, I then chose to use the next example, which would be a focus event. So then I started talking about that. I brought in the definition from one of those resources that you would use. I think it was Mozilla in this example. And then one of the things that they note that's important to talk about was the fact that the opposite of focus is blur, which isn't when you first read that and you're going through it, it's not so intuitive as to why you would need to know that beforehand. So that's one of the reasons why I just chose to use blur, to really highlight what the events actually are and why it matters knowing what it does. So I pretty much just took the example that they used in that same reference document, which in this case, I broke down the next event listener, the focus one, in the same similar format that I did up above, but because like we've done it before, I even shorten the process. That way someone reading it can get more used to, okay, this is how you do it, breaking it down completely. Now we're doing the same thing with something else and you don't have to break it down as much. You should be able to like get it faster and faster as you go through. So I then went on and explained focus, broke it down in the same way, using kind of like less words, and then explain like in this instance, like what that focus did, which was change the background to pink. I showed that with these pictures of like, hey, when you click on it and it's selected, it turns the background to pink. And then I added an example of this last one to show blur, because that's how they showed how focus worked. And it wasn't until like I knew how blur worked that I fully understood how focus worked. So I followed that same logic in explaining it. I then broke down the blur event, and because that's set to equal an empty string, which should set the color to blank, you get the results of when something is being clicked on initially, it turns pink. But if you click on it again, it stays pink because it's still being selected. And then on blur means that when that same element, or yeah, in this case, how we wrote it, when that same element gets unselected, and that can happen in multiple different ways, but the easiest way is to just click on something else, which gets shown by the highlighted box on the text input rather than the password input box. That something else has been highlighted, and now this box is no longer pink. So yeah, through all of that, like I know it kind of goes off on a tangent and the whole thing is event listeners, but I tie it back in by just reminding the reader that the only things that changed, or the only things that stayed consistent and didn't change throughout my examples, were the 3 keywords: add event listener every single time. So by recognizing that, you're able to eliminate a lot more that you have to figure out. And then from there, you just kind of follow the same formula or the same format and same like approach to how we did the first example, which is, okay, it's an element, something within the system, and then it's a add event listener. So I'm going to add to that something that's going to listen for an event, which we will name at this portion, and then that will execute a function. So that's just basically what my blog is about, to just like break all event listeners down, regardless of what the type is per se, and get it to where you can understand like this same thing is occurring every single time. It's listening for an event and it's going to respond to it.